evening from Louisville, Kentucky, the site of the first presidential debate of the 1984 campaign. Actually, it's not quite a debate. They'll be questioned by 3 journalists and a panel moderated by Barbara Walters. The candidates now are coming on stage. And now the president of the League of Women Voters.
Good evening from the Kentucky Center for the Arts in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm Dorothy Ridings, president of the League of Women Voters, the sponsor of tonight's first presidential debate between Republican Ronald Reagan and Democrat Walter Mondale. Tonight's debate marks the 3rd consecutive presidential election in which the League is presenting the candidates for the nation's highest office in face-to-face debate. Our panelists are James Weehart, national political correspondent for Scripps Howard News Service, Diane Sawyer, correspondent for the CBS program 60 Minutes, and Fred Barnes, national political correspondent for the Baltimore Sun. Barbara Walters of ABC News, who is appearing in her 4th presidential debate, is our moderator. Barbara.
Thank you, Dorothy. A few words as we begin tonight's debate about the format. The position of the candidates, that is, who answers questions first and who gives the last statement, was determined by a toss of a coin between the 2 candidates. Mr. Mondale won, and that means that he chose to give the final closing statement. It means, too, that the president will answer the first question first. I hope that's clear. If it isn't, it will become clear as the debate goes on. Further, the candidates will be addressed as they each wanted and will therefore be called Mr. President and Mr. Mondale. Since there will also be a second debate between the 2 presidential candidates tonight, we'll focus primarily on the economy and other domestic issues. The debate itself is built around questions from the panel. In each of its segments, a reporter will ask the candidates the same general question. Then, and this is important, each candidate will have the chance to rebut what the other has said. And the final segment of the debate will be the closing segment, and the candidates will each have 4 minutes for their closing statements. And as I have said, Mr. Mondale will be the last person on the program to speak. And now I would like to add a personal note, if I may. As Dorothy Ridings pointed out, I have been involved now in 4 presidential debates, either as a moderator or as a panelist. In the past, there was no problem in selecting panelists. Tonight, however, there were to have been 4 panelists participating in this debate. The candidates were given a list of almost 100 qualified journalists from all the media and could agree on only these 3 fine journalists. As moderator, and on behalf of my fellow journalists, I very much regret, as does the League of Women Voters, that this situation has occurred. And now let us begin the debate with the first question from James Weehart. Mr. Weehart.
Mr. President, in 1980, you promised the American people in your campaign a balanced budget by 1983. We've now had more and bigger deficits in the 4 years you've been in office. Mr. President, do you have a secret plan to balance the budget sometime in a second term? And if so, would you lay out that plan for us tonight?
I have a plan, not a secret plan. As a matter of fact, it is the economic recovery program that we presented when I took office in 1981. It is true that earlier, working with some very prominent economists, I had come up during the campaign with an economic program that I thought could rectify the great problems confronting us, the double-digit inflation, the high tax rates that I think were hurting the economy, the stagflation that we were undergoing. Before even the election day, something that none of those economists had even predicted had happened, that the economy was so worsened that I was openly saying that what we had thought on the basis of our plan could have brought a balanced budget, no, that was no longer possible. So the plan that we have had and that we're following is a plan that is based on growth in the economy, recovery without inflation, and reducing the share that the government is taking from the gross national product, which has become a drag on the economy. Already, we have a recovery that has been going on for about 21 months to the point that we can now call it an expansion. Under that, this year, we have seen a $21 billion reduction in the deficit from last year based mainly on the increased revenues the government is getting without raising tax rates. Our tax cut, we think, was very instrumental in bringing about this economic recovery. We have reduced inflation to about a third of what it was. The interest rates have come down about 9 or 10 points, and we think must come down further. In the last 21 months, more than 6 million people have gotten jobs. There have been created new jobs for those people to where there are now 105 million civilians working where there were only 99 million before, 107 if you count the military. So we believe that as we continue to reduce the level of government spending, the rate of increase in government spending, which has come down from 17 to 6%, and at the same time as the growth in the economy increases the revenues the government gets without raising taxes, those two lines will meet. And when they meet, that is a balanced budget.
Mr. President, the Congressional Budget Office has some bad news. The lines aren't about to meet according to their projections. They project that the budget deficit will continue to climb. In the year 1989, they project a budget deficit of $273 billion. In view of that, and in view of the economic recovery we are now enjoying, would it make sense to propose a tax increase or take some other fiscal measures to reduce that deficit now when times are relatively good?
The deficit is a result. It is the result of excessive government spending. I do not, very frankly, take seriously the Congressional Budget Office projections because they have been wrong on virtually all of them, including the fact that our recovery wasn't going to take place to begin with. But it has taken place. But as I said, we have the rate of increase in government spending down to 6%. If the rate of increase in government spending can be held at 5%, we're not far from there. By 1989, that would have reduced the budget deficits down to a $30 or $40 billion level. At the same time, if we can have a 4% recovery continue through that same period of time, that will mean, without an increase in tax rates, that will mean $400 billion more in government revenues. And so I think that the lines can meet. Actually, in constant dollars, in the domestic side of the budget, there has been no spending increase in the 4 years that we have been here.
Mr. Mondale, the Carter-Mondale administration didn't come close to balancing the budget in its 4 years in office either, despite the fact that President Carter did promise a balanced budget during his term. You have proposed a plan combining tax increases and budgetary cuts and other changes in the administration of the government that would reduce the projected budget deficit by 2/3 to approximately $87 billion in 1989. That still is an enormous deficit that will be running for these 4 years. What other steps do you think should be taken to reduce this deficit and position the country for economic growth?
One of the key tests of leadership is whether one sees clearly the nature of the problems confronted by our nation. And perhaps the dominant domestic issue of our times is what do we do about these enormous deficits? I respect the president. I respect the presidency, and I think he knows that. But the fact of it is, every estimate by this administration about the size of the deficit has been off by billions and billions of dollars. As a matter of fact, over 4 years, they've missed the mark by nearly $600 billion. We were told we would have a balanced budget in 1983. It was $200 billion deficit instead. And now we have a major question facing the American people, as to whether we will deal with this deficit and get it down for the sake of a healthy recovery. Virtually every economic analysis that I've heard of, including the distinguished Congressional Budget Office, which is respected by, I think, almost everyone, says that even with historically high levels of economic growth, we will suffer a $263 billion deficit. In other words, it doesn't converge, as the president suggests. It gets larger even with growth. What that means is that we will continue to have devastating problems with foreign trade. This is the worst trade year in American history by far. Our rural and farm friends will have continued devastation. Real interest rates, the real cost of interest, will remain very, very high. And many economists are predicting that we're moving into a period of very slow growth because the economy is tapering off and maybe a recession. I get it down to a level below 2% of gross national product with a policy that's fair. I've stood up and told the American people that I think it's a real problem, that it can destroy long-term economic growth, and I've told you what I think should be done. I think this is a test of leadership, and I think the American people know the difference.
Mr. Mondale, one other way to attack the deficit is further reductions in spending. The president has submitted a number of proposals to Congress to do just that, and in many instances, the House, controlled by the Democrats, has opposed them. Isn't it one aspect of leadership for prominent Democrats such as yourself to encourage responsible reductions in spending and thereby reduce the deficit?
Absolutely, and I have proposed over $100 billion in cuts in federal spending over 4 years, but I am not going to cut it out of Social Security and Medicare and student assistance and things that people need. These people depend upon all of us for the little security that they have. And I'm not going to do it that way. The rate of defense spending increase can be slowed. Certainly we can find a coffee pot that costs something less than $7,000. And there are other ways of squeezing this budget without constantly picking on our senior citizens and the most vulnerable in American life. And that's why the Congress, including the Republicans, have not gone along with the president's recommendations.
I would like to ask the audience, please, to refrain from applauding either side. It just takes away from the time for your candidates. And now it is time for the rebuttal. Mr. President, 1 minute for rebuttal.
Yes, I don't believe that Mr. Mondale has a plan for balancing the budget. He has a plan for raising taxes. And as a matter of fact, the biggest single tax increase in our nation's history took place in 1977. And for the 5 years previous to our taking office, taxes doubled in the United States, and the budget's increased $318 billion. So there is no ratio between taxing and balancing a budget. Whether you borrow the money or whether you simply tax it away from the people, you're taking the same amount of money out of the private sector unless and until you bring down government's share of what it is taking. With regard to Social Security, I hope there will be more time than just this minute to mention that, but I will say this. A president should never say never, but I'm going to violate that rule and say never. I will never stand for a reduction of the Social Security benefits to the people that are now getting them.
Mr. Mondale?
Well, that's exactly the commitment that was made to the American people in 1980. He would never reduce benefits. And of course, what happened right after the election is they proposed to cut Social Security benefits by 25%, reducing the adjustment for inflation, cutting out minimum benefits for the poorest on Social Security, removing educational benefits for dependents whose widows were widows trying to get them through college. Everybody remembers that. People know what happened. There's a difference. I have fought for Social Security and Medicare and for things to help people who are vulnerable all my life, and I will do it as President of the United States.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin with segment number 2 with my colleague Diane Sawyer. Ms. Sawyer?
Mr. President, Mr. Mondale, the public opinion polls do suggest that the American people are most concerned about the personal leadership characteristics of the two candidates, and each of you has questioned the other's leadership ability. Mr. President, you have said that Mr. Mondale's leadership would take the country down the path of defeatism and despair, and Vice President Bush has called him whining and hoping for bad news. And Mr. Mondale, you have said that President Reagan offers showmanship, not leadership, that he has not mastered what he must know to command his government. I'd like to ask each of you to substantiate your claims. Mr. Mondale first. Give us specifics to support your claim that President Reagan is a showman, not a leader, has not mastered what he must know to be president after 4 years. And then second, tell us what personal leadership characteristics you have that he does not.
Well, first of all, I think the first answer this evening suggests exactly what I'm saying. There is no question that we face this massive deficit. And almost everybody agrees, unless we get it down, the chances for long-term healthy growth are nil. And it's also unfair to dump these tremendous bills on our children. The president says it will disappear overnight because of some reason. No one else believes that's the case. I do, and I'm standing up to the issue with an answer that's fair. I think that's what leadership is all about. There's a difference between being a quarterback and a cheerleader. And when there's a real problem, a president must confront it. What I was referring to, of course, in the comment that you referred to, was the situation in Lebanon. Now, for 3 occasions, one after another, our embassies were assaulted in the same way by a truck with demolitions. The first time, and I did not criticize the president because these things can happen once and sometimes twice. The second time, the barracks in Lebanon were assaulted, as we all remember. There was 2 or 3 commission reports, recommendations by the CIA, the State Department, and the others. And the third time, there was even a warning from the terrorists themselves. Now, I believe that a president must command that White House and those who work for him. It's the toughest job on earth. And you must master the facts and insist that things that must be done are done. I believe that the way in which I will approach the presidency is what's needed. Because all my life, that has been the way in which I have sought to lead. And that's why in this campaign, I'm telling you exactly what I want to do. I am answering your questions. I am trying to provide leadership now before the election so that the American people can participate in that decision.
You have said, Mr. Mondale, that the polls have given you lower ratings on leadership than President Reagan because your message has failed to get through. Given that you have been in public office for so many years, what accounts for the failure of your message to get through?
Well, I think we're getting better all the time, and I think tonight, as we contrast for the first time our differing approach to government, to values, to the leadership in this country, I think as this debate goes forward, the American people will have for the first time a chance to weigh the two of us against each other. And I think as a process, as a part of that process, what I am trying to say will come across, and that is that we must lead, we must command, we must direct, and a president must see it like it is. He must stand for the values of decency that the American people stand for, and he must use the power of the White House to try to control these nuclear weapons and lead this world toward a safer world.
Mr. President, the issue is leadership in personal terms. First, do you think, as Vice President Bush said, that Mr. Mondale's campaign is one of whining and hoping for bad news? And second, what leadership characteristics do you possess that Mr. Mondale does not?
Well, whether he does or not, let me suggest my own idea about the leadership factor, since you've asked it. And incidentally, I might say that with regard to the 25% cut to Social Security, before I get to the answer to your question, the only 25% cut that I know of was accompanying that huge 1977 tax increase was a cut of 25% in the benefits for every American who was born after 1916. Now, leadership. First of all, I think you must have some principles you believe in. In mine, I happen to believe in the people and believe that the people are supposed to be dominant in our society. That they, not government, are to have control of their own affairs to the greatest extent possible with an orderly society. Now, having that, I think also that in leadership, I've believed that you find people, positions such as I'm in, who have the talent and ability to do the things that are needed in the various departments of government. I don't believe that a leader should be spending his time in the Oval Office deciding who's going to play tennis on the White House court. And you let those people go with the guidelines of overall policy and not looking over their shoulder and nitpicking the manner in which they go at the job. You are ultimately responsible, however, for that job. But I also believe something else about that. I believe that, and when I became governor of California, I started this and I continue it in this office, that any issue that comes before me, I have instructed cabinet members and staff, they are not to bring up any of the political ramifications that might surround the issue. I don't want to hear them. I want to hear only arguments as to whether it is good or bad for the people. Is it morally right? And on that basis, and that basis alone, we make a decision on every issue. Now, with regard to my feeling about why I thought that his record spoke his possible taking us back to the same things that we knew under the previous administration, his record is that he spoke in praise of deficits several times, said they weren't to be abhorred, that as a matter of fact, he at one time said he wished the deficit could be doubled because they stimulate the economy and help reduce unemployment.
As a follow-up, let me draw in another specific, if I could, a specific that the Democrats have claimed about your campaign, that it is essentially based on imagery. And one specific that they allege is that, for instance, recently you showed up at the opening ceremony of a Buffalo old age housing project, when in fact, your policy was to cut federal housing subsidies for the elderly, yet you were there to have your picture taken with them.
Our policy was not to cut subsidies. We have believed in partnership, and that was an example of a partnership between not only local government and the federal government, but also between the private sector that built that particular structure. And this is what we've been trying to do, is involve the federal government in such partnerships. We are today subsidizing housing for more than 10 million people. And we're going to continue along that line. We have no thought of throwing people out into the snow, whether because of age or need. We have preserved the safety net for the people with true need in this country, and it has been pure demagoguery that we have in some way shut off all the charitable programs, or many of them, for the people who have real need. The safety net is there, and we're taking care of more people than has ever been taken care of before by any administration in this country.
Mr. Mondale, an opportunity for you to rebut.
Well, I guess I'm reminded a little bit of what Will Rogers once said about Hoover. He said, it's not what he doesn't know that bothers me, it's what he knows for sure that just ain't so. The fact of it is, the president's budget sought to cut Social Security by 25%. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. And when the president was asked the other day, what do you want to cut in the budget? He said, cut those things I asked for but didn't get. That's Social Security and Medicare. The second fact is that the housing unit for senior citizens that the president dedicated in Buffalo was only made possible through a federal assistance program for senior citizens that the president's budget sought to terminate. So if he'd had his way, there wouldn't have been any housing project there at all. This administration has taken a meat cleaver out in terms of federal assisted housing, and the record is there. We have to see the facts before we can draw conclusions.
Mr. President.
Well, let me just respond with regard to Social Security. When we took office, we discovered that the program that the Carter-Mondale administration had said would solve the fiscal problems of Social Security for the next 50 years wouldn't solve them for 5. Social Security was due to go bankrupt before 1983. Any proposals that I made at that time were at the request of the chairman, a Democrat of one of the leading committees, who said we have to do something before the program goes broke and the checks bounce. And so we made a proposal. And then in 1982, they used that proposal in a demagogic fashion for the 1982 campaign. And 3 days after the election in 1982, they came to us and said, Social Security, we know, is broke. Indeed, we had to borrow $17 billion to pay the checks. And then I asked for a bipartisan commission, which I'd asked for from the beginning, to sit down and work out a solution. And so the whole matter of what to do with Social Security has been resolved by bipartisan legislation, and it is on a sound basis now for as far as you can see into the next century.
Mr. President, we begin segment number 3 with Fred Barnes.
Mr. President, would you describe your religious beliefs, noting particularly whether you consider yourself a born-again Christian, and explain how these beliefs affect your presidential decisions?
Well, I was raised to have a faith and a belief and have been a member of a church since I was a small boy. In our particular church, we did not use that term, born again, so I don't know whether I would fit that particular term. But I have, thanks to my mother, God rest her soul, the firmest possible belief and faith in God. And I believe, I should say, as Lincoln once said, that I would be the most stupid man in the world if I thought I could confront the duties of the office I hold, if I could not turn to someone who is stronger and greater than all others. And I do resort to prayer. At the same time, however, I have not believed that prayer should be introduced into an election or be a part of a political campaign or religion, a part of that campaign. As a matter of fact, I think religion became a part of this campaign when Mr. Mondale's running mate said I wasn't a good Christian. So it does play a part in my life. I have no hesitancy in saying so. And as I say, I don't believe that I could carry on unless I had a belief in a higher authority and a belief that prayers are answered.
Given those beliefs, Mr. President, why don't you attend services regularly, either by going to church or by inviting a minister to the White House, as President Nixon used to do, or someone to Camp David, as President Carter used to do?
The answer to your question is very simple about why I don't go to church. I have gone to church regularly all my life, and I started to here in Washington. And now, in the position I hold and in the world in which we live, where embassies do get blown up in Beirut, we're supposed to talk about that on the debate the 21st, I understand. But I pose a threat to several hundred people if I go to church. I know the threats that are made against me. We all know the possibilities of terrorism. We have seen the barricades that have had to be built around the White House. And therefore, I don't feel, and my minister knows this and supports me in this position, I don't feel that I have a right to go to church knowing that my being there could cause something of the kind that we have seen in other places, in Beirut, for example. And I miss going to church, but I think the Lord understands.
May I ask The audience, please, to refrain from applause. Fred, your second question.
Mr. Mondale, would you describe your religious beliefs and mention whether you consider yourself a born-again Christian, and explain how those beliefs would affect your decisions as president?
First of all, I accept President Reagan's affirmation of faith. I'm sure that we all accept and admire his commitment to his faith, and we are strengthened, all of us, by that fact. I am a son of a Methodist minister. My wife is the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. And I don't know if I've been born again, but I know I was born into a Christian family. And I believe I've sung at more weddings and more funerals than anybody ever to seek the presidency. Whether that helps or not, I don't know. I have a deep religious faith. Our family does. It is fundamental. It's probably the reason that I'm in politics. I think our faith tells us, instructs us about the moral life that we should lead. And I think we're all together on that. What bothers me is this growing tendency to try to use one's own personal interpretation of faith politically, to question others' faith, and to try to use the instrumentalities of government to impose those views on others. All history tells us that that's a mistake. When the Republican platform says that from here on out we're going to have a religious test for judges before they're selected for the federal court, and then Jerry Falwell announces that that means they get at least 2 justices of the Supreme Court, I think that's an abuse of faith in our country. This nation is the most religious nation on earth. More people go to church and synagogues than any other nation on earth, and it's because we kept the politicians and the state out of the personal exercise of our faith. That's why faith in the United States is pure and unpolluted by the intervention of politicians. And I think if we want to continue, as I do, to have a religious nation, let's keep that line and never cross it.
Thank you. Mr. Barnes, next question. We have time for rebuttal now.
I think I have a follow-up.
Yes, I asked you if you did. I'm sorry,
Yes,
I thought you
did.
waived it.
Yes, Mr. Mondale, you complained just now about Jerry Falwell, and you've complained other times about other fundamentalists in politics. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't recall you ever complaining about ministers who are involved in the civil rights movement or in the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, or about black preachers who've been so involved in American politics. Is it only conservative ministers that you object to?
No. What I object to is someone seeking to use his faith to question the faith of another, or to use that faith and seek to use the power of government to impose it on others. A minister who is in civil rights or in the conservative movement, because he believes his faith instructs him to do that, I admire. The fact that the faith speaks to us and that we are moral people, hopefully, I accept and rejoice in. It's when you try to use that to undermine the integrity of private religious faith and the use of the state is where, for the most personal decisions in American life, that's where I draw the line.
Thank you. Now, Mr. President, rebuttal.
Yes, it's very difficult to rebut because I find myself in so much agreement with Mr. Mondale. I, too, want that wall that is in the Constitution of separation of church and state to remain there. The only attacks I have made are on people who apparently would break away at that wall from the government side, using the government, using the power of the courts and so forth, to hinder that part of the Constitution that says the government shall not only not establish a religion, it shall not inhibit the practice of religion. And they have been using these things to have government, through court orders, inhibit the practice of religion. A child wants to say grace in a school cafeteria, and a court rules that they can't do it because it's school property. These are the types of things that I think have been happening in a kind of a secular way that have been eroding that separation, and I am opposed to that. With regard to a platform in the Supreme Court, I can only say one thing about that. I have appointed one member of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. I'll stand on my record on that, and if I have the opportunity to appoint any more, I'll do it in the same manner that I did in selecting her.
Mr. Mondale, your rebuttal, please.
The platform to which the president refers, in fact, calls for a religious test in the selection of judges. And Jerry Falwell says that means we get 2 or 3 judges. And it would involve a religious test for the first time in American life. Let's take the example that the president cites. I believe in prayer. My family prays. We've never had any difficulty finding time to pray. But do we want a constitutional amendment adopted of the kind proposed by the president that gets the local politicians into the business of selecting prayers that our children must either recite in school or be embarrassed and asked to excuse themselves? Who would write the prayer? What would it say? How would it be resolved when those disputes occurred? It seems to me that a moment's reflection tells you why the United States Senate turned that amendment down, because it will undermine the practice of honest faith in our country by politicizing it. We don't want that.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. Our time is up for this round. We go into the second round of our questioning. Begin again with Jim Weihart. Jim?
After that discussion, this may be like going from the sublime to the ridiculous, but here goes. I have a political question for you, Mr. Mondale. Polls indicate a massive change in the electorate away from the coalition that has long made the Democratic Party a majority. Blue-collar workers, young professionals, their children, and much of the middle class now regard themselves as independents or Republican instead of Democrats, and the gap, the edge the Democrats had in party registration seems to be narrowing. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Mondale, what is causing this? Is the Democratic Party out of sync with the majority of Americans? And will it soon be replaced as a majority party by the Republicans? What do you think needs to be done about it as a Democrat?
My answer is that this campaign isn't over yet. And when people vote, I think you're going to see a very strong verdict by the American people that they favor the approach that I'm talking about. The American people want arms control. They don't want this arms race. And they don't want this deadly new effort to bring weapons into the heavens. And they want an American foreign policy that leads toward a safer world. The American people see this debt, and they know it's got to come down. And if it won't come down, the economy is going to slow down, maybe go into a recession. They see this tremendous influx and swamping of cheap foreign imports in this country that has cost over 3 million jobs, given farmers the worst year in American history, and they know this debt must come down as well because it's unfair to our children. The American people want this environment protected. They know that these toxic waste dumps should have been cleaned up a long time ago. And they know that people's lives and health are being risked because we've had an administration that has been totally insensitive to the law and the demand for the protection of the environment. The American people want their children educated. They want to get our edge back in science. And they want a policy headed by the president that helps close this gap that's widening between the United States and Europe and Japan. The American people want to keep opening doors. They want those civil rights laws enforced. They want the Equal Rights Amendment ratified. They want equal pay for comparable effort for women. And they want it because they've understood from the beginning that when we open doors, we're all stronger, just as we were at the Olympics. I think as you make the case, the American people will increasingly come to our cause.
Mr. Mondale, isn't it possible that the American people have heard your message and they are listening, but they are rejecting it?
Well, tonight we had the first debate over the deficit. The president says it'll disappear automatically. I've said it's going to take some work. I think the American people will draw their own conclusions. Secondly, I've said that I will not support the cuts in Social Security and Medicare and the rest that the president has proposed. The president answers that it didn't happen, or if it did, it was resolved later in a commission. As the record develops, I think it's going to become increasingly clear that what I am saying and where I want to take this country is exactly where the country wants to go, and the comparison of approaches is such that I think will lead to further strength.
Mr. President, you and your party are benefiting from what appears to be an erosion of the old Democratic coalition. But you have not laid out a specific agenda to take this shift beyond November 6th. What is your program for America for the next decade with some specificity?
Well, again, I am running on the record. I think sometimes Mr. Mondale's running away from his. But I'm running on the record of what we have asked for. We'll continue to try and get things that we didn't get in the program that has already brought the rate of spending of government down from 17% to 6.1%. A program of returning authority and autonomy to the local and state governments that has been unjustly seized with the federal government. And you might find those words in a Democratic platform of some years ago. I know because I was a Democrat at that time. And I left the party eventually because I could no longer follow the turn in the Democratic leadership that took us down an entirely different path. A path of centralizing authority in the federal government, lacking trust in the American people. I promised when we took office that we would reduce inflation. We have, to 1/3 of what it was. I promised that we would reduce taxes. We did, 25% across the board. That barely held even with, if it did that much, with the gigantic tax increase imposed in 1977. But at least it took that burden away from them. I said that we would create jobs for our people, and we did, 6 million in the last 20 or 21 months. I said that we would become respected in the world once again, and that we would refurbish our national defense to the place that we could deal on the world scene and then seek disarmament, reduction of arms, and hopefully an elimination of nuclear weapons. We have done that. All of the things that I said we would do, from inflation being down, interest rates being down, unemployment falling, all of those things we have done. And I think this is something the American people see. I think they also know that we had a commission that came in a year ago with a recommendation on education, on excellence in education. And today, without the federal government being involved, other than passing on to them, the school districts, the words from that commission, we find 35 states with task forces now dealing with their educational problems. We find that schools are extending the curriculum to now have forced teaching of mathematics and science and so forth. All of these things have brought an improvement in the college entrance exams for the first time in some 20 years. So I think that many Democrats are seeing the same thing this Democrat saw. The leadership isn't taking us where we want to go.
Mr. President, there's much of what you said affects the quality of life of many Americans, their income, the way they live, and so forth. But there's an aspect of quality of life that lies beyond the private sector, which has to do with our neighborhoods, our cities, our streets, our parks, our environment. In those areas, I have a difficulty seeing what your program is and what you feel the federal responsibility is in these areas of the quality of life in the public sector that affects everybody, and even enormous wealth by one individual can't create the kind of environment that he might like.
There are tasks that government legitimately should enforce, and tasks that government performs well, and you've named some of them. Crime has come down the last 2 years for the first time in many, many decades that it has come down, or since we've kept records, 2 consecutive years, and last year it came down, the biggest drop in crime that we've had. I think that we've had something to do with that, just as we have with the drug problem nationwide. The environment, yes, I feel as strongly as anyone about the preservation of the environment. When we took office, we found that the national parks were so dirty and contained so many hazards, lack of safety features, that we stopped buying additional parkland until we had rectified this with what was to be a 5-year program, but it's just about finished already, $1 billion, and now we're going back to budgeting for additional lands for our parks. We have added millions of acres to the wilderness lands, to the game refuges. I think that we're out in front of most, and I see the red light is blinking, so I can't continue, but I got more.
Well, you'll have a chance when your rebuttal time comes up, perhaps, Mr. President.
Right.
Mr. Mondale, now it's your turn for rebuttal.
The president says that when the Democratic Party made its turn, he left it. The year that he decided we had lost our way was the year that John F. Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon. I was chairman of Minnesotans for Kennedy. President Reagan was chairman of a thing called Democrats for Nixon. Now, maybe we made a wrong turn with Kennedy, but I'll be proud of supporting him all of our life, all of my life, and I'm very happy that John Kennedy was elected, because John Kennedy looked at the future with courage, saw what needed to be done, and understood his own government. The president just said that his government is shrinking. It's not. It's now the largest peacetime government ever in terms of the take from the total economy. And instead of retreating instead of being strong where we should be strong, he wants to make